Riot or peaceful protest? I can argue whether the Boston Tea Party was a riot or a peaceful protest. So recently, there have been a controversy regarding how different news outlets have portrayed recent protests. Some news outlets have portrayed them as primarily peaceful protests, while others have emphasized riots. Similarly, the colonists emphasized the Boston Tea Party was an orderly, peaceful protest, while the British argued it was a lawless, riotous event. So you're going to read the primary sources below and then argue if you think the Boston Tea Party was a riot or a peaceful protest. And you'll complete this worksheet, click on it, make a copy. You'll follow along in the video with me as we read these three texts below. So here's the first text, and this is from a well-respected historian. It's published in 1982. This is more recent, about 30 years ago. The colonists believed that the Tea Act left them no choice. It expressed still another claim by Parliament of the right to tax them. This claim meant, as far as they were concerned, that the English plot to enslave them had been revived. If they went on paying the duty now that the government's intentions were laid bare, they would be cooperating with the enslavers. So just to kind of explain this quote, and we do want to print quotation marks there. And so the Tea Act gave them no choice because it lowered the price of tea and it lowered the tax, but it still had a tax within the price. And it's just automatically taxed. And so this is Parliament saying, hey, it's just a really small tax. You can just give into it. And the colonists are thinking in their mind, Parliament, it's just the principle of it. Even though it's a small tax, even though it's a really small price, you're still saying that you have the right to tax us. And we disagree with that. And if you can take our property without our consent, then that is slavery. And so if we cooperate with this tax, then we are agreeing with being enslaved. And so they felt like they had to fight against it. And so that they believe deeply in the principle of private property. You own property and no one can take that property. The government can't take that property without your consent or without your permission, is what they would say. Number two, this is a primary source. It's from the Massachusetts Gazette and Boston Weekly, so it was published in each of these newspapers, December 23rd, 1773, and I don't have the exact date of the Boston Tea Party, but this is like, I think, just a couple of days later. A large number of colonists were gathered in the largest assembly hall in Boston, waiting to hear if Governor Hutchinson had agreed to send the tea ships back. They learned that he had refused. And so that's my introduction. Here's the actual text. A number of brave and resolute men, dressed in the Indian manner, approached near the door of the assembly, gave the war whoop, but silence being commanded and a peaceable deportment was again enjoyed until the dissolution. So what this means is they announced Governor Hutchinson has refused to send the ships back. And so we got to dump the tea. And all these people are dressed, these colonists are dressed as Indians, my understanding primarily to disguise their individual identity so that they don't get in trouble individually or get arrested individually. And so people are really excited. They're like, woohoo, we're going to go to fight. We're going to go chop these up. We're going to dump the tea in the harbor. But then the leaders are like, no, we got to have absolute silence. We're not going to have, this isn't going to be a crazy riot. And then so they call the end of the meeting. That's the dissolution. And the Indians, as they were then called, went to the wharf where the ships lay that had the tea on board and were followed by hundreds of people to see the event of the transaction of those who made so grotesque an appearance. So there's people dressed like Indians with like black all over their face and feathers, and there's all this crowd just watching them. They, the Indians, immediately went on board Captain Hall's ship, where they hoisted out the chests of tea and went upon deck, stove the chests, and emptied the tea overboard, and then continued to two other ships. They applied themselves so skillfully to the destruction of the tea that in the space of 3 hours they broke up 342 chests and discharged the contents into the dock. When the tide rose, it floated the broken chest and the tea, insomuch that the surface of the water was filled therewith a considerable way from the south part of the town to Dorchester Neck, and lodged on the shores. So the top, surface of the water is covered in tea, and that's why they call it the Boston Tea Party. It's like a joke. They're turning this giant harbor into a giant teacup. There was the greatest care taken to prevent the tea from being purloined or stolen by the populace. One or two being detected in endeavor means to try. So one or two were trying to steal, to pocket a small quantity, were stripped of their acquisitions, meaning they took the tea away from these people that are trying to steal the tea, and very roughly handled. So they beat up a couple colonists that were trying to steal the tea. So there's kind of a strange thing where you're like, it's okay to destroy millions of dollars worth of tea, but it's not okay to steal a handful. And it is worthy of remark that although a considerable quantity of goods were still remaining on board the vessels, no injury was sustained. Such attention to private property was observed that a small padlock belonging to the captain of one of the ships being broke, another was procured and sent to him. So one of the locks that was on the ship belonged to the captain. And so they bought a new lock and they brought it back to the captain and said, basically, we're so sorry we broke your lock. Here's your lock. That's worth maybe $10 or $20. And by the way, we just destroyed millions of dollars worth of tea. The town was very quiet during the whole evening. And so why is it okay to destroy millions of dollars worth of tea, not steal a handful of tea, and not steal a block or break a lock on the ship that belongs to the captain? And the reason is because they believe deeply in private property, and they believe that this is the right the British are violating, and they don't want to be hypocrites. They don't want to violate this right. And so they're not going to steal things. They're not going to destroy other people's property, but they're only going to destroy the tea because the tea is trying to take away their property. And so that's the purpose of the Boston Tea Party. And then here's the third source, and this is Samuel Cooper, and he's also a colonist and a participant. And this earlier Boston Gazette, this is only from the colonist perspective. And this man is from a colonist perspective. So it's kind of hard that we have primary sources, but we only have them, in this case, from the colonists themselves. And so, of course, they want to portray the event in the most positive light. And furthermore, this account is only published in 1834. And you can see that the original thing happened in 1773. And so this is like 60 years later. And so this guy might have been 20 when it happened, and now he's recounting it. He's remembering it from 80 years before. And so those are kind of concerns a historian might have from these accounts. He says, immediately after, a group of about 20 men, disguised as Indians, was seen to approach in single file by the west door of the church. They marched with silent steps down the aisle, and so passed by the south door, brandishing their tomahawks in that direction. Arrived at the wharves, where they divided into 3 troops, each with a leader, gained possession of the ships quietly, and proceeded to lighten them of their cargo by hoisting out of the boxes, emptying their contents into the dock. No noise was heard except the occasional clink of the hatchet in opening the boxes, and the whole business was performed with so much expedition that before 10 o'clock that night, the entire cargo of the 3 vessels were deposited in the docks. Many a wishful eye was directed to the piles of tea which lay on the docks, and one poor fellow who could not resist the temptation had filled the lining of his cloak with about a bushel of the plants. He was soon observed by the crowd, and the process of lightening of his burden was short. He was dragged a little distance on the wharf to a barrel, and was soon furnished with a coat of tar and shavings, or sawdust. And so this guy says one of the people that tried to steal was tar and put sawdust or shavings on him. And so, again, they believe that this guy was violating, their order. They believe deeply in like having order and organization. They marched, and they were marching with silent steps, and they're not destroying any other property, and not stealing. And so they were trying really hard to have a demonstration where they're destroying only the T. And so complete the worksheet. Reach out to me if you have any questions.